it seems to me like there are a lot of companies out there that maybe the ones that kept the continuous improvement and project managers, they're more nimble. They can move ahead out of faster out of the pandemic and go right into their growth phase. But what about the people that are left behind in the organization that maybe there are only two or three when there were 10 on the team, and they have to do more with less after people in the organization were left go. So how do you manage that? How do you do more with less? Layla, what would you say about that? Giving people some tips on how to manage it.
Well, I don't want to say the good news, but some of these industries that I'm involved with, like oil and gas, cyber, when you get into the tech space, we're used to cycles, right? Things do go up and down. Oil prices go up and down. So there's at least we're leveraging reality. Like we have this all the time where prices go up and prices go down, and we got to be nimble. So if you can leverage the culture, the innate culture of the organization, that's step one. Like you've got an advantage there. So I get to see that. And so what you try to do is, this is not something we've never seen before type attitude is very helpful with those types of companies. If you want to ask, like, what do you do if you're in a company that's not used to that, always had good times, never saw something bad, and then suddenly gets hit, that's a little more difficult. That type of feeling is, wait a minute, we don't even know how to do that. I don't have my CI people anymore. I'm not used to crisis. Now what do I do? That's where individuals really have to step up and start being smart and innovative and try to look at what they're doing and see if there's a better way to do it. And they might not have any infrastructure to do that. So again, the consequence of this pandemic is hitting companies at the core. If they've got the culture that's used to this, they'll probably be better off in the long run. If they don't, those are the ones that we're probably going to start seeing more layoffs, more shutdowns, and more suffering. So that's another aspect of this, letting people go a little bit too early in the crisis.
I'd like to ask Susan if she can recommend some tips on maybe different tools that are available out there to prioritize what David is saying, keep it simple, and put the labor and materials, where they're needed most. How do you decide where they're needed most without a complete week-long analysis of something when you don't have time, right? So what would you say how would you do that, Susan?
Yeah, that's a great question, Wendy. And first I would say both leaders and people that are working on the front line or doing, everyday jobs need to approach this. And what you don't want to do is continue to do what you had been doing before. And so have people work until 1 a.m., still producing the same reports, still doing the same amount of work. And you want to ask the strategic question of, is what I'm doing value adding? And look at the tasks. From a worker bee perspective, what are the tasks you do on a daily basis? And ask a very simple question. Is it value adding? And by value adding, we mean, is the customer willing to pay you to do that? Is it value enabling? That means it allows the value adding steps to be done faster, better, or more efficiently. Or is it neither of those two, in which case it's non-value added? If you can get agreement on that non-value added stuff, just stop doing it. And even perhaps if nobody asks you, stop doing it and see who screams the most. So from a worker bee perspective, you can look at what you do and what you provide every day to your internal customers. Yes, that question. From a leader perspective, you don't want to forget that your people are burdened with all the same work with fewer number of people. And you want to ask them to think about this using this same lens and document those activities. Give them the freedom to say, we're not going to do this anymore. We don't have the time or resources. And to tag on to what David says, keep it simple. Those things that you maintain, try to simplify them and take the number of steps out to streamline, make it easier for everybody.
Fidel, if you can just speak to how continuous improvement people can really add the value to the organization, like what can they do right now that would help companies come out of the other end of the pandemic with no issues?
Sure. So it's an age-old question here, right? How do you do more with less? How do continuous improvement people add value to the organization, right? So one of my mentors used to say there are two types of business breeds. There's show dogs and there's do dogs. Now, you need both of them in business, but during a crisis situation like today, this is when the dogs shine, right? So what are some of the things I think, like Susan alluded to, you got to be very strategic, right? So this is actually an ideal time to get with your suppliers, get with your customers. It may be counterintuitive, but instead of running away from the situation and keeping a low profile, it might actually be the right time to negotiate better terms and price. Go back and face the issue. Don't work in a silo environment. Both your customers and your suppliers will remember time and appreciate that you faced the issue head on, being upfront with them and try to get to a win-win situation. I think it actually will help in the long run because they'll remember that, as you mentioned, coming out of this crisis mode and into the recovery mode. So this is where a continuous improvement person really does shine. So for instance, focus on leadership and not on consensus, and use your independent thinking skills. Try to understand what people are really needing. What's the real issue? Is it getting something to market quickly? Is it focusing on some kind of variable cost? Is it maybe some kind of information that they're needing or wanting to make a decision? That's where the CI person really does shine and adds value.
Okay, so here's my big question after you were talking. Is it better to have continuous improvement people inside your organization permanently long term, or is it better to hire them as needed for each individual project so they don't get swamped, bogged down with day to day? What do you think of that, David?
Yeah, I would say there's always good in having outside eyes, but from a history standpoint and from a knowing the business standpoint, you still have to have somebody inside. So the best way to do is in surge situations, and this is a surge situation, you bring consultants in to support the way that kind of the CI is kind of ingrained at that company. Because what you don't want to do is you have somebody come in and even and there's nobody there to pick up the pieces. And so I've seen cases where you spend a lot of money on consultants, you bring them in, and let's say when the pandemic is over, okay, they came up with all these ideas. Where do they get these numbers from? Why did they make that decision? And because you don't have somebody that's entrenched and kind of in there for the long haul, you don't have that shifting of knowledge in between the outside eyes and the internal eyes. That's what I would say.
How effective is CI working remote versus on site, and how do you market remote-based CI? To me, it depends on what industry you're talking about. In my experience, if you're in finance or billing or IT or even tech industry, those are industries that are very used to functioning remotely. And in those, you can do CI work without really skipping a beat remotely. In a company like manufacturing, where the CI work is going to be hands-on, it's really hard to do that unless you're in the plant. So it really depends on the industry. And I think to add on to David's point, if you are brought in from the outside, let's say to help a company figure out how to fix a particular problem, if you don't have somebody that you can hand it to, it is going to fail. So you need both in reality. The external consultant can go to a number of different places, see different things and share best practices, but the internal one is the one that's really going to make it stick.
We're about to close our session, but we would like to invite everybody who joined us today to contact any one of us with any specific issues or questions that you have. In fact, the more questions you give us, it would help us design a future webinar to maybe even help more people, even as we talk about, getting hired as a continuous improvement expert, moving forward. There are so many other things that we can talk about. Hopefully you got a lot of information out of this today. Like we said, we will be sharing the video. Oh, here comes the PowerPoint. There it is. That's everybody's LinkedIn and email. So you can address specific questions to each of the experts today. And you can invite people to other sessions. We're hoping to have a follow-up to this and add some additional information and maybe talk a little bit more about, using Lean Six Sigma, tips like that, project management tips, things that help people just be more efficient to do more with less. Anyway, I'd like to thank everyone for joining us today, for all the participants, and I'd like to thank all the experts. And I'd like you to stay tuned for more information for us for a future webinar. Thank you so much.
Thank y'all.